In this case, we focus on a question. Could the roughly 500,000 Jews in Germany during the Hitler era have gotten out if they had wanted to? Was Hitler somehow holding them captive as soon as he rose to power? Would the Nazis actually have been delighted to let the Jews of Germany leave? If so, why didn't they? And at what point did it in fact become impossible for Germany's Jews to leave the country? 1935, when the Nuremberg laws were enacted? 1938, after the notorious events of Kristallnacht, when every synagogue in Germany and Austria was put to the torch? 1939, when World War II broke out? Clearly, Germany's Jews didn't leave. The question is whether they couldn't leave or whether they chose to stay. Let's imagine how one of the leaders of the German Jewish community, a Reform rabbi, scholar, and theologian, Leo Beck, might have assessed the growing threat posed by the Nazis. If he could be our teacher, what would he share?
As the leader of Reform Judaism and representative of all German Jews during the Nazi era, I witnessed a perceptible shift in the identity of the Jewish community slowly and over time. In short, we went from being Jewish Germans to German Jews to Jews in Germany. The first term puts the stress on Germans. We were Jewish Germans, in the same way people might speak today of Jewish Americans. The fact that we were living in Germany was our main point of identity. Being Jewish was our secondary identification. The second expression stresses Jews. As our persecution increased, Germans ceased to be our main point of identity. Finally, we were reduced to being merely Jews in Germany. We were still living in Germany but ceased to be Germans.
My name is Eliezer, a Zionist Jew originally from Lviv in western Ukraine. And let me share a few things about our people, especially in these days. We Jews have always been a communal people, establishing organizations and societies within societies from antiquity down to the present. When it comes to Germany, on the Jewish side of the spectrum are the Zionists, mostly of Eastern European descent, representing only about 10% of the German Jewish community. Ironically, many of us had fled to the West to avoid persecution, only to find ourselves in Hitler's domain. How odd that it took real persecution, the kind we Jews had experienced in Eastern Europe and Russia, to drive us into the Zionist ranks and to look toward Palestine. But 90% of the German Jewish community, including Reformed Jews, preferred to stay put.
The main group of Jewish Germans at the dawn of the Nazi era was more toward the middle, the CV or Central Verein, that is, the Central Association of Jews, to which I belonged. Some 60% of the Jewish community identified with the CV. Somewhat straddling the center were Jewish veterans of World War I, belonging to the so-called RJF, and comprising another 30% or so of the Jewish population. Many of those were joint members of the CV. Moving to the German side of the spectrum, there was an unaffiliated group called the VJ, the Vereinigung der Juden, or Association of Jews. These were upper-middle-class Jewish Germans whose identity was completely defined by their long-standing residence in Germany. They were the last to think of evacuating their homeland.
From Hitler's perspective, perhaps they needed a little encouragement. On the 1st of April 1933, the Nazis were confident enough to declare their boycott of Jewish shops and businesses. A few days later, a law directed at Jewish civil servants was also passed. It was understandably received by all of us Jews with traumatic shock. Nevertheless, Germany was still a state of law. While Jewish civil servants were to be retired, they were still to receive their pensions, and the law did not apply to those who had fought in World War I or whose fathers or sons were killed in the war. In spite of what was happening around us, our Jewish community still retained a sense of security. Not everything was falling apart, we felt. Now we happen to have a chilling document published on June 1st, 1933, reflecting the position of the German Jews as seen by Alfred Wiener of the leadership of the CV. It is called Between Heaven and Earth.
The great majority of German Jews remains firmly rooted in the soil of its German homeland, despite everything. There may be some who have been shaken in their feeling for the German fatherland by the weight of recent events. They will overcome the shock, and if they do not overcome it, then the roots which bound them to the German Mother Earth were never sufficiently strong. but according to the ruling of the laws and regulations directed against us, only the Aryans now belong to the German people. What are we then? Before the law we are non-Germans, without equal rights. To ourselves, we are Germans with full rights. We reject it, to be a folk or national minority, perhaps like the Germans in Poland or the Poles in Germany, because we cannot deceive our own innermost feelings. We wish to be subject as Germans with equal rights to the new government and not to some other creation, whether it is called League of Nations or anything else. Thus we are suspended between heaven and earth. We will have to fight with courage and strength in order to get back to earth, in the eyes of state and law too.
The CV was expressing what most German Jews still felt even after Hitler was fully ensconced in power as Führer. Before the law, we are no longer Germans, but we still regard ourselves as Germans, and we will keep the old orientation. In other words, we are not going anywhere. In the end, we Zionists, amounting to about 10% of the German Jewish community, did emigrate to Palestine. That means about 90% of German Jews stayed. So maybe the position of the CV wasn't so wise after all. Nevertheless, the Jews of Germany did come together to form a new voluntary organization called the RV, the Reichsvertretung der Deutschen Juden, the representation of German Jews, presided over by Rabbi Leo Beck. In the very wording of this organization, we noticed the shift in identity from Jewish Germans to German Jews. Jews who had all along felt more German than Jewish now felt distinctly more Jewish. The proclamation establishing the RV in September 1933 makes this clear.
At a time that is as hard and difficult as any in Jewish history, but also significant as few times have been, we have been entrusted with the leadership and representation of the German Jews. Much of our former economic security has been taken from us German Jews, or at least reduced. Within the area that remains to us, the individual must be drawn away from his isolation. Occupational connections and associations, where permissible, can increase existing strength and give support to the weak, and can make experience and contacts useful for all. There will be not a few who will be refused a place of work or the exercise of their profession on German soil. We are faced by the fact, which can no longer be questioned or opposed, of a clear historic necessity to give our youth new living space. It has become a great task to discover places and open roads, as on the sacred soil of Palestine, for which Providence has decreed a new era, as everywhere where the character, industry and ability of the German Jews can prove themselves, robbing none of their bread, but creating a livelihood for others.
That was 1933, but as time passed, a more centralized Jewish organization became necessary after the Jewish communities in Germany were denied legal rights. After Kristallnacht, many leaders of the RV were arrested, but the Nazis needed an organization like the RV to facilitate their dealings with Jews. So in July 1939, the Gestapo approved its reorganization as the RVI, the Reichsvereinigung der Juden in Deutschland, the national representation of Jews in Germany. The RVI was led by many former leaders of the RV, including Rabbi Leo Beck. Controversially, some have dubbed them as slaves of the Nazis. Others argue that this does them and history a disservice, since they labored courageously to help many, such as myself, escape Germany while representing those who remained with dignity. But in the final analysis, the Jews of Germany had to give up their most important identification. That was the identity shift. We went from being Jewish Germans to German Jews to Jews in Germany.
The emigration tables of the period are striking. In 1933, 37,000 Jews left Germany. In 1934, 23,000. Oddly, the number actually decreased after people got accustomed to the persecution. In 1935, 21,000 left. In 1936, 25,000. In 1937, 23,000. In 1938, 35,369 from Germany and 62,958 from Austria, which had now been annexed by the Nazis. After Kristallnacht, in November 1938, a mass panic and mass exodus ensued to anywhere, at any price. Of the approximately 500,000 Jews in Germany and 200,000 Jews in Austria, about half had emigrated by the outbreak of war.
In the end, roughly half of the German Jews were exterminated and half saved. But of those who did leave, who knew which country or countries would be safe? Who knew that while Switzerland would be safe, Holland would not?
the year 1935, which brought the notorious Nuremberg laws, represents the turning point in recognizing that emigration was the only answer. For those who remained, the restrictions progressively tightened. As Jews were expelled from German schools, the option remaining was to create Jewish schools.
Over time, separate spheres of life arose under the Nazis. An entire Jewish subculture was created. For example, a group of Jewish athletes was brought from Petah Tikva in Palestine to play with German Jews under the noses of the Nazis, who did not object. Many German Jews who, up to now, had been quite assimilated, were suddenly attracted to Jewish culture, including Yiddish plays and so on. Surprisingly enough, the Nazis approved. This Jewish Renaissance continued until the end of 1938. In the midst of oppression, it made life somehow more bearable. But as a result, they were less inclined to get out while they could. Ironically, the Jewish Renaissance actually caused more Jews to remain in Germany rather than leave as I did and perish as a result.
After 1938, the infamous letter J was stamped on Jewish passports. By then, Jews would go anywhere, and Germany would still allow them to leave. But who would take them? There were a few friendly destinations. Argentina took 25,000. Shanghai took between 15 and 18,000.
Other Jews, such as the prominent philosopher Walter Benjamin, despaired and committed suicide. If only free nations had opened their doors. As for me, I struggle with survivor's guilt every day. The stories of tragedy are everywhere. They can never be erased from our collective memory, and the rest is history.
Indeed, the rest is history.